Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. If you want to know what your fellow Vermonters think about things, the best source is likely UVM Center for Rural Studies. Every year for the past 27 years, the center conducts a statewide Vermonter poll. The poll gauges public opinion on a host of issues, such as paid family leave, broadband availability, and eating habits. There is much more to the poll and the Center for Rural Studies, so to find out, I'm joined by Michael Moser. Michael wears many hats within the Center for Rural Studies. He's a research specialist, and he's also the coordinator of the Vermont State Data Center. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So what is the UVM Center for Rural Studies?
Well, the Center for Rural Studies is a research center based within the University of Vermont, and we conduct research with Vermont agencies and departments in the state government, with nonprofit organizations, and really for anyone that comes to us, sometimes the federal government, sometimes national organizations as well.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you do at the center?
I do some of those, I work on some of those research projects, and I also coordinate something called the Vermont State Data Center.
Mm-hmm. So what should Vermonters know about the data center and why?
Well, so the Vermont State Data Center is part of it's a federal cooperative program with the U.S. Census Bureau. And I essentially am a liaison between the Census Bureau and Vermont data users and producers. Mm-hmm. And so in that role, I facilitate Vermont data going up to the federal government, data collection processes. And I also do a lot of education and outreach here in Vermont to make sure that Vermonters can use those census data products as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And so for some people it might seem trivial to collect census information, but the reality is that the census helps determine how more than $400 billion in federal funding is spent each year. So this is really important work for the state.
Yes, absolutely. So you know, we all pay federal taxes, and that money goes out of the state, but Vermont actually receives more in federal dollars back than it sends out. And in order to ensure that we're receiving as much federal money as we're supposed to, we need to accurately count every single Vermonter.
Mm-hmm. And so the next U.S. Census is 2 years away in 2020, but work is already underway behind the scenes. Rebecca Gollin tells us more about that.
How many people live in Brattleboro? What percentage of Fairfax residents commute for work? What's the average age of a citizen in Bradford? These questions and more are answered every 10 years in the census.
This data is available on the census website right now.
While there's still some time before the next one in 2020, there's a lot to do to get ready.
We only get one chance a decade to count everyone in the United States.
Cynthia Gillum is a geographic specialist with the Census Bureau. She is leading training workshops for towns and municipalities in advance of the 2020 count.
Today we had a workshop about the local update of census addresses, LUCA. It's an operation that the census takes on ahead of Census 2020 for decennial to make sure that we have all of the local addresses in the United States in our master address file.
Having up-to-date addresses not only helps the Census Bureau get the most accurate results, it also helps towns stay on top of the information they need.
We're going to participate as part of the statewide effort in partnership with 911 to update and improve the census address lists, but we also want the towns to know that they can have a role in that at the local level.
Leslie Pelch works for the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. She helped organize the workshop. It's important that towns know about the effort to update addresses because the information that gets collected can have a big impact.
The census count is used to make decisions about representation in Congress and also about money and how money flows to the states. So we want to make sure that Vermont communities get all the money from federal sources that is due to them, and that we're represented appropriately.
And it's not just the federal money that's at stake. Many state-level decisions are based on the census information as well.
So within the state, it's used to do redistricting, and so it's really important for each town's count to be accurate so that as redistricting is looked at, we're using accurate numbers to decide how many representatives a community should have or how many communities should be grouped together to have representation at the state legislature.
Census data is very important to our town. We're in the process of updating our town plan, and we're using a lot of the community surveys and local data from anything from commute time to what kind of heating oil people use. You know, I find that data is so important across the board for town planning, as well as using it for grant applications and figuring out what the needs are in our town.
Amber Soto is the zoning administrator and 911 coordinator for the town of Fairfax. The updated address list, and eventually the census data that will come, helps the town understand the needs of its residents.
Right now, something that's big in Fairfax is pedestrian mobility and connectivity, and figuring out who's bike riding, who's busing, what type of recreation facilities that they're needing.
These are the different address counts that we have according
Soto is anticipating that updating addresses in Fairfax will be straightforward, and the benefits are clear.
I think that it's a benefit to the town as far as grants and money coming in and where we're investing our resources, how many people actually live in our village center versus outskirts, and making sure we're capturing all the farm properties, and just making sure that we have accurate data for our town. And I just think it's our duty to make sure that we're helping make that right.
New for the 2020 census, people will be able to respond to the questions online. The Census Bureau will be sending out postcards with a unique identifier to log into the questionnaire. They will also be sending out paper versions. In Montpelier, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
More information can be found on the Census website. That address is census.gov. Then search for Vermont. Back here in the studio, I'm with Michael Moser of the Vermont Center for Rural Studies. As we've said, the 2020 census is still 2 years away now, but why is it important to start working right now on this?
Well, so the Census Bureau, or the decennial census, is actually one of our largest, government operations undertaken by the federal government in any one distinct period of time. And so we're talking about sending folks out into communities across the country to knock on doors and collect this information. So we're talking about thousands of people gearing up over a period of years. There's a very thorough testing process that occurs to ensure that the data are being collected in using the best practices and the best methods possible. So the decennial census doesn't just happen in 2020. It actually, takes 5 to 7 years to scale up and be ready and prepared so that when they are collecting the data, that it's as smooth a process as possible.
What are some of the other ways that you've seen census data used?
Sure. Some of the other interviews mentioned some of the other uses. We see it used by businesses to do market research to understand where they might want to place a business, sell their goods and services, or perhaps look for employees that have certain population characteristics that they are requiring. We see the nonprofit sector use Census Bureau data to apply for grants. Often, a lot of times federal grants require that you use Census Bureau data to prove that the population you're trying to serve is deserving of those programs. We see municipalities using the Census Bureau data for their planning processes, and state government as well for planning and projecting, forecasting what the needs are going to be of the population into the future. So lots of different ways that it's used. I'm at the University of Vermont, and academics are always using the Census Bureau data. I do a lot of education with students as well as they're in their, as they're learning about data, and I'll go in and chat with them about how it's important, and they do community profiles and things like that in their classroom activities as well.
Are people surprised to realize how much information is gathered?
Yeah, I'd say so. The Census Bureau doesn't just collect the data decennially, so every 10 years. They also have ongoing data collection processes. The American Community Survey is one of those, which is just continuous data collection across the country, as well as in Vermont, obviously. And the Census Bureau is the federal government's statistical organization, so they partner with other entities in the federal government, like the Bureau of Labor. They'll work with them to produce labor statistics. They'll work with the Agency of Housing and Urban Development, so HUD. They'll work with them to collect data. So across the board, they're working with lots of different agencies all the time to produce hundreds of data sets, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Do things change that much in Vermont from one census to the next?
So 10 years is a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Populations change quite a bit in 10 years. And so it's certainly, that's why we have something called the American Community Survey, so that there's always sort of updated data that's trickling in on a regular basis to sort of capture those trends as the smaller trends as they're happening over time. The decennial census is really, at this point, it serves as a sort of a foundational piece for our data collection in the intercensal years.
Mm-hmm. Are there different ways that the data is collected? You mentioned postcards will go out.
Yeah, so for the decennial census, in 2020 there will be postcards being sent out to every address in the country, as a matter of fact, which is a huge effort, obviously. And those postcards will have a special code that you'll be able to use to go online and respond to the decennial census for your household. It's really important, obviously, to provide this data and to be counted accurately. And this is a really easy way for folks to do that. Right up front, it's more efficient, more cost effective for the Census Bureau to do that. And if you just think that you can get away with tossing that in the trash and not having to think about data collection about your household, you'll then eventually be visited by someone with the clipboard and the name tag from the Census Bureau who will come and knock on your door, and they're going to do everything they can to collect as accurate a data set as possible from all citizens in the U.S.
And so I mentioned at the beginning of the program that you're also the driving force behind the annual Vermonter poll. Talk a little bit about the history of that and the significance of this poll.
Sure. So the Center for Rural Studies collects data for Vermont-centric data for a variety of organizations and entities in the state of Vermont. So the Census Bureau data is one big piece of that work that we do with collecting and curating Vermont-centric data. Excuse me. The Vermonter poll is a statewide public opinion survey that we conduct every year. We've been doing it since about 1997. Mm-hmm. So it's also longitudinal, which is nice. We can compare data sets over time as well. And that's a contract project where researchers, organizations can contract with the center to ask a handful of questions and get statewide opinions on issues that are important to their organization, their research, or to Vermonters in general.
Mm-hmm. Can you give me some examples of some of the research?
Sure. So on the Vermonter poll, we collect data on migrant labor and opinions about migrant labor in the state of Vermont. We collect data on Vermonters' opinions of trapping in the state of Vermont. That one has been an interesting one of recent research that we've done. We collect data on things like sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, and how Vermonters feel about perhaps being taxed to drink sodas. And policymakers can turn around and use that information, that public opinion information, to help them understand where voters sit and how they feel about these things, and that's it's very useful for those purposes.
Right, and also to imagine as time goes on, people's opinions change too, which is why it's important to keep up to date on that.
They absolutely do. Another data set that we've been working on recently, which is not part of the Vermonter poll, it's a standalone, but it's called the Vermont Happiness and Well-Being Study that we've been working on. It's a component of an effort that's sort of under the moniker Gross National Happiness USA. And that happiness and well-being study really seeks to collect data from Vermonters in a more holistic fashion regarding their overall well-being within a series of domains and several metrics. And so that's been very useful for us to understand overall well-being as it relates to census data indicators of poverty and median income, and so we can compare and contrast some of those indicators.
If people want more information or want to look at previous Vermonter polls, what can they do?
Well, they can always come to our website, uvm.edu/CRS, or if you just Google Center for Rural Studies, I think we're the only one out there that's named like that. So, yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us.
That's our
Thanks.
program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.